So you do think a lot of that is effort related, the tackling issues specifically on defense?
I think mostly. I think tackling is almost always effort related, just because at the Division I level, everybody understands the technique, and everybody has, in differing levels, capabilities of making those plays. And we've seen a lot of the guys out there for K-State make those plays. But I think, after getting beat 45-0 a couple weeks ago, the tough loss last weekend, and then getting down early and getting down big early to Texas, I think guys gave up.
So how much of the blame then is fair to put on the personnel issues that occurred because of COVID? Because I know that that was really the post-game spin, was that, one, Texas is bigger, faster, stronger, and two, so Elijah Sullivan was playing safety, which they had moved him there because of some issues, and then he winds up getting hurt 3 plays in. Jerron McPherson was out for the second half. Echo Boydo didn't play. And the linebackers are still getting back into shape after missing the 3 weeks that they did for contact tracing. How much is fair to attribute to that versus just not plain wanting to be there and tackle?
Yeah, I don't know how much I'm buying into that, simply because leading up to the Oklahoma game, after we had just gotten beat by Arkansas State at home, we were hearing about how the team was depleted, how, there was a chance the game wasn't going to get played. It sounded like, to some extent people were hedging, expecting the team to get throttled. They didn't. They got a huge win, and you didn't hear hardly anything about how they got that huge win with a depleted roster. So now, fast forward a couple of months to the last game of the season, now you're trying to use some of those same issues as excuses for a really frustrating loss. And I just don't know, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And so I don't know that you can ignore those issues in one respect when you won, and then point to them specifically and exclusively when you get wiped off the field by a pretty mediocre football team. And so again, I get it, especially not having Elijah Sullivan and Justin Hughes out there in their normal capacities. That's very, that's a tough pill to swallow, but we've done it all year long. Guys have stepped in, guys have made plays. The effort's never been a question. Saturday, that appeared to be different. So I'm not really relying on COVID as being the excuse for giving up 69 points.
Curry Sexton is talking with us. So on that front, then, we see effort as an issue against Texas. Chris Kleiman talked about there being accountability problems with guys. That was after the Iowa State game. So we've heard these sorts of things before. Now guys at the end of the year, in your eyes, are giving up here. How much concern is there to you about just the general culture of the locker room, especially after you've had so much attrition with the roster now being up to 12 players that have left this year?
Yeah, I would say it's very concerning. Last week when we talked, I stated that it was my hope the team would find a way to end the season on a high note, assuming that we weren't able to get into a bowl game, or I guess either way. I wanted to see the team go out and play well enough that they could hang their hat on their performance going into the offseason, and that's exactly the opposite of what they did. And so I think when you mix the end-of-season performance with the attrition that you just mentioned, and the potentially extremely long layoff between last football game to start of off-season workouts, that's a lot for guys to think about and a lot for guys to consider. And so I really think that there is a lot to be concerned about, things that I just mentioned, plus the ongoing effects of this pandemic. It's a tough time, and you start losing a locker room. I've been in some locker rooms with guys who are trying to pull the team apart at the seams, and once it starts happening, it can quickly unravel. I think you've seen that with the basketball team at K-State over the last several years, and I hope and I trust that Coach Kleiman and his staff will be able to get that corrected. Get the leadership within the team to take over and to keep guys intact. But from the outside looking in, there are, in my mind, a lot of things to be concerned about.
Is this a matter of, do you buy into, hey, this is a coach that was a player's coach and has been too hands-off, and there should have been more discipline, more reaction to players sooner before it got to this point?
I think there's probably something to that. I think obviously Coach Kleiman seems to be a guy who truly cares about his players, and there's some reciprocation there, which is a great thing. And I don't think you ever want to take that away. But it does seem, and granted, I was a Coach Snyder guy, and I played for a coach who, didn't accept penalties, didn't accept any discipline errors. And over the last couple of years, despite some of the really good things that Coach Kleiman and his teams have done, we've seen a lot of lapses in mental judgment and discipline. I mean, this team has been penalized more than it ever has been historically. I mean, we've seen a lot more assignment errors, and so I do think that there's a way. I mean, I think you see it from different coaches across the country, and I'm not speaking to Coach Kleiman specifically because I haven't been around the program enough with him there to know exactly that dynamic. But we've seen it with coaches like Dabo Sweeney, with various others who are able to walk that line. They're able to be a player's coach while expecting and demanding discipline and attention to detail. And so I think that there is a balance that you can strike there. And I don't know if that's something that needs to be, they need to attempt to strike or not. But I think it can be done. And I do think that there are issues, at least in my eyes, with respect to discipline and things of that nature.
Yeah, and I would say I hope that it makes a big difference if next year's not in a pandemic and they will actually be able to meet face-to-face because, I mean, a bunch of the meeting time has been cut down. These coaches don't have a chance to develop the relationships with the players like they typically would, and I know that's something that's been talked about a lot, which I would think that has to factor into it if your MO is as a player's coach, right? Because so much of that is dependent on, especially if we're talking about attrition, so much of that is dependent on, hey, making sure that the player knows that you've got their back, and that can't really be faked over a Zoom camera or just meeting in a spread out giant team meeting once a week. A lot of that has to occur on a more intimate level, I would think.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, there's, you can't oftentimes really gauge the intent of a statement, electronically in the same way that you can in person. And looking back, there were times where a coach would, my position coach would rail on me during a position meeting or someone else. But then during or after that meeting, they're taking that guy and they're, putting their arm around him and saying, hey, I'm being hard on you because I expect more. And so you're right. There are probably times when the coaches aren't able to do things like that and to make sure that they're keeping guys, keeping their morale up, and keeping them, keeping their confidence up. And so I think you are right. I mean, I think you have to take everything that's gone on and that will continue to transpire over whatever remains of the season with a huge grain of salt. But you just hope that all of the kind of undercurrent, all the factors that are attributing to that undercurrent don't continue to swirl until it gets to the point where it's really problematic.
Did you have both Michael Smith and Andre Coleman as your position coach? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I had them 2 years each.
Okay. What's the most upset one of those guys ever was with you?
That would have been going into my junior season. I had gotten hurt in 2012 to end, TCU game. I broke my collarbone before we got beat by Baylor. And then, Smitty leaves right around signing day of that 2013. So we get a new position coach in, and I get I get hurt like the third day. I pulled my hamstring like the third day of spring ball. So I missed most of all of spring ball with my new position coach. So then fast forward to fall camp, and I'm a starter. I'm the number 3 guy alongside Tyler and Tremaine. And one of the very first days, we're not even in pads yet, and I missed a block. And, Coach Coleman railed on me pretty hard at practice. But then in the meeting room that night, I mean, he just absolutely came unglued. And we got into it pretty good. And that carried over, after the meeting into his office. And, yeah, things got pretty intense there. But just like you said, I mean, he came back later. We made sure we were on the same page. and our relationship grew and to the point where it was incredibly strong. But if not for the ability to talk in person, that could have gone a much different way. So yeah, that was probably the most intense interaction I had with a position coach.